last leg of our three-part series on prayer. What are we doing? And tonight's talk will be about prayer and human needs. By Soloveitchik and other recent thinkers, and we're delighted to have with us Dr. David Shatz, who's a professor of philosophy at Yeshiva University and the editor of Torah U'Madda Journal. His publications are varied. They include, among other things, interfaith relations, theodicy, artistic creativity, religious fanaticism, the ethics of persuasion. We're always delighted to have Dr. Shatz speak, and we are grateful that he could make it. I also want to call your attention on scattered around this Beit Midrash. There's a little flyer that says Drisha Summer Kollel for college students, and we have both the June and July programs, full-time programs. The June program is for young men and women, college students, who want to work intensively. So if you know anybody you think could be interested, take the flyer, put it somewhere, talk to people. It's one of the better things we do here at Drisha. And we encourage all students who are appropriate to be fully involved. Again, Dr. Shatz, who actually taught many years ago at Drisha and comes from time to time to teach here as well. We're very delighted to have him this evening. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Shatz, Prayer and Human Needs, Rabbi Soloveitchik, and other recent thinkers.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi Silber, especially given the theme of the lecture and of the series. I guess it's appropriate to begin with my stock joke that this is the Chazoras HaShatz. Okay. Actually, Rabbi Silber and I are very old friends. We're very old friends. Back in the 70s, I remember when my wife and I would come to my mother's apartment at the Apthorpe on 79th and Broadway. Very, very often, we'd have Rabbi Silber, who then was not married. We'd have him over for lunch. And I remember his coming up more than once with the idea, you know what I should do? I'm going to try to start a school for women. And I said, yeah, right, it's going to work. Yeah, right. It was a very different climate in those days, and really a tremendous, tremendous yasher koach for decades of success. I'm going to start with something that you might call the pre-philosophic view of prayer, or the pre-mystical view of prayer, or the pre-Hasidic, or the pre-theoretical view of prayer. Or another way to put this would be sort of the balabatish, poshet pshat, simple, maybe even some would say naive view of prayer. It goes something like this: that in prayer what we are doing is praying for our needs to be met. Prayer is a technique for acquiring certain things by petitioning God for them. By praying, we are also tacitly and explicitly affirming the fact that we are dependent upon God. He is the one who is, for example, Chonein Hadat. He grants knowledge. He is Mevarech Hashanim. He blesses the year. He is the Rofei Ne'eman B'Rachaman. He is our healer, and so forth. We affirm that precisely by praying for him. And we also recognize that because we are dependent, we are also weak. And we know that not every prayer is going to be answered in the affirmative. Not every prayer has a positive sequel. But God's power to grant or not grant will always remain. And of course there are other elements. We must be grateful to God for providing what he provides, etc., etc. I call this the pre-philosophical, pre-mystical, and balabatish view of prayer because once philosophers and mystics get their hands on it, get their hands on prayer, things start looking very, very different. Bertrand Russell, a great British philosopher, said, quote, "The point of philosophy is to start with something so simple as not to seem worth stating, and to end with something so paradoxical that no one will believe it." That does sometimes happen, and just to give you an example of the sorts of transformations that the concept of prayer can undergo, take, for example, what's called the theurgic view of prayer. It's the idea that the aim of prayer is to create some kind of cosmic change for the better, to unify the Godhead, even that's not for our sake, but it's for the sake of the Godhead, to restore the cosmos, rather different from what I call the balabatish view of things. And of course, there are concerns people have about something that Rabbi Held spoke about a few weeks ago, which is the questions about egocentrism, about petitioning, sort of reflecting too much concern for the self. Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, one of the important thinkers of the 20th century, said that prayer is, quote, religion's most problematic child. The problems are numerous, he said. Now, I think that this gap between the pre-philosophic and the philosophic and pre-mystical and mystical is itself something that's worthy of attention in a separate forum, because the question is, what are these views doing? Do they think that, for example, they're capturing the authorial intent, what Chazal originally meant when they proposed prayer and so forth? There are some interesting questions of methodology, and someone I know said that the substance of a scholarly article is inversely proportional to the number of times that the word methodology appears in it. So I won't go the route of methodology, but I would like to discuss with you some of the sources that are on the accompanying sheets. The aim of going through these sources is, of course, partly to fill in information, but it's much more than that. Because what these sources really do is to show, I think, the extent of some of the difficulties with the sort of the standard view that we started with, and also to suggest some other ways of thinking about it. I mean, just other ways to think about what human needs are doing in the context of prayer. Let's start then with page 1 of the source book, which is from a late thinker, Berkovitz, who is not as well known as his sibling, namely Nechama, his sister Nechama. Berkovitz was one of the most colorful and cantankerous Jewish philosophers of the 20th century. Someone remarked to me that if he lived in America, he wouldn't be taken seriously. But in Israel, he was so colorful. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. And the fact that he was colorful just added to the mystique. To give you some idea, when a scholar reaches a certain milestone in his life, his or her life, the scholar is given a festschrift, right? A collection of essays in his or her honor. Well, there is a book of essays about Leibovitz that could be called an anti-festschrift. The title was Shalila Lishma, which means negation for its own sake. It's a play on the central concept in Leibovitz of Avodah Lishma. It could probably mean either we're negating him for his own sake, or he goes around negating things for its own sake. And the preface to the book explains why it's being written. They say, well, he's had a lot of harmful things to say over the years, but, we figured the man was going to, he's getting old, getting on in years, and it wouldn't be such a force anymore. Our problem is that now he's publishing more than ever. So therefore we have to have this book as a response. He was very controversial, and yet at the same time he had quite a number of very interesting insights. One of them I saw summarized as, first I thought Leibovitz himself had said, and then I was told that it doesn't really exist. It's sort of like everywhere in his writings, but nowhere in particular. It says that religion is not, this is not there on the sheet, religion is not the first rule of public speaking. Stay one Xerox ahead of your audience. Religion is not God serving man. Religion is man serving God, to be part of the gendered language. Or, as Leibovitz puts it, look, our aim, it's not that God is our servant, God is doing things for us. We're supposed to do His will. He says, Lo Yorda Shechina al Har Sinai, the Shechina did not come down on Mount Sinai. Actually could have stopped right there since he himself doesn't quite believe that statement is meaningful. But the Shechina did not come down on Mount Sinai, L'malei funtzia shel rofei kupat cholim. It's not to fulfill the function of some doctor in the Kupat Cholim. Similarly, the Bible is not a book of scientific information. Physics professor. He was very clear about this, that prayer is not for human benefit. This is an idea that he got from Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher. I always specify Kierkegaard's nationality, because usually you say the word Kierkegaard to an audience, it's instant schluff. But you say the word Danish to a Jewish audience, picks up. Superficially, this sounds like a lot of other things we're familiar with. For example, the statement by Antignos ish Sopho that you should not be like servants who serve the master for the sake of receiving reward, but rather who serve the master not for the sake of receiving reward. Or it sounds like Maimonides' concept of avodah me'ahava, of service of God out of love, where you will completely eliminate ulterior motives, even the motive of achieving olam haba. And it sounds also like Albert Einstein. If you look at the bottom of page 1, I like to describe Einstein as the guy with the mustache, bad hair day, and he was named after a medical school. Einstein's address at Princeton, 1939-1940. You can find the address on the web. It's very fascinating, and keep in mind, Einstein did not believe in a personal God, but he had a certain conception of what religion is, and it's actually similar to Rabbi Heschel. A person who is religiously enlightened, wrote Einstein, appears to me to be one who has, to the best of his ability, liberated himself from the fetters of the selfish desires and is preoccupied with thoughts, feelings, and aspirations to which he clings because of their superpersonal value. In other words, you get rid of all the egocentrism and instead you cling to values. Now I said that this sounds like Leibovitz, and I added the word superficially. I say superficially because although Leibovitz would certainly agree with these statements, he's saying something much more radical and much more sweeping. This is not just about selfish interests. This is about human interests. Religion for him is not about human interests at all. It's not a question of being egoistic. It's a question of being anthropocentric. In fact, I wouldn't even say anthropocentric. I'd say caring about humans at all, even forgetting the centric part. Eccentric, maybe. It's an eccentric view. This is a very, very sweeping view. And so much so, the one wonders, well, why would anyone believe it? I mean, it seems to me that this is an idea kind of, run amok. But the basic, fundamental idea that religion is there not as a promise only, but as a demand, is certainly, I think, a very powerful idea. And that's what makes Leibovitz somewhat paradoxical. Because the core idea seems to be a compelling one, and yet when you carry out the consequences, they seem very strange. And he has a reasoning behind this, and let's take a look at the bottom here. Let's take a look at the quote with Leibovitz. Halachic observance as a way of life precludes conversion into a means to some ulterior end. And again, the end is not just for the performer, but for anybody. Most of the mitzvot are meaningless except as expressions of worship. They have no utility in terms of the satisfaction of human needs. Okay? And then he distinguishes two concepts of prayer. One, and we hear often about this from Psalm 102, Tfilah le'ani ki ya'atov, a prayer of the afflicted when he is faint and pours out his complaint before God. That's one concept of prayer. You pour out what your needs are. Second, prayer is defined in the prayer book. The prayer book does not express the spontaneous outpouring of the soul. It contains a text of fixed prayer, imposed upon one as a duty, and not conditioned by his spiritual, material needs or his feeling. The prayer book is what you follow. That's what true prayer is. You are following the law. The same 18, and here is his argument, the same 18 benedictions are recited by the bridegroom before his wedding ceremony, by the widower returning from the funeral of his wife, and the father who has just buried his only son. Recitation of the identical set of psalms, in the Hebrew this is particularly moving, is the daily duty of the person enjoying the beauties and bounty of this world and the one whose world has collapsed. The same order of supplications is prescribed to those who feel the need for them and those who do not. In other words, his argument is that tefillah is invariant. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are. You pray the same Shemona Esrei as everybody else. Therefore, the prayer is not tailored to your needs. Now, somebody might come back and say, well, yeah, look, that's true, but, we pray for the community needs. But, Leibovitz could simply iterate the argument at the next level. Because the communities also do not vary the text of the Shemona Esrei according to their particular needs. Some communities, whether a community has been ravaged by a tsunami, or whether it's plagued by poverty, or whether there is a plague of some disease, no matter what the circumstances, and no matter what the emphasis of the community is at that moment, the Shemona Esrei doesn't change. And that's Leibovitz's argument for saying that therefore it is not about human needs. Now, in truth, there is a way to make it all coherent, and that is to say exactly what I just said. Well, it's not about individual needs, and it's not about community needs, it's about human needs. It's about needs that are common to all people, and the reason it remains invariant is that what we're doing is speaking about the needs of humanity. So there's a reply, in other words, to Leibovitz, that the point of the Shemona Esrei is to discuss needs. It is slanted in that sense, but at the same time, they're general human needs, not the needs of any specific individual, not the needs of any specific community. Now, look, there are a lot of things to be negative about in this theory. In truth, it has certain, it echoes somewhat the statement by Maimonides, which is on the sheet, which I'll leave out for the moment. But it leads to so many odd consequences. This means that a person who prays can be utterly indifferent, emotionally indifferent to what the words mean. Secondly, why are these particular words chosen? Why do we say heal us? Why do we say redeem us? I mean, if all this is about is just an expression of worship, so then why do we talk about saving us? And here Leibovitz has a really strange answer. He quotes Maimonides. Maimonides says at one point, Maimonides believed all the mitzvot have reasons, but he said that sometimes there's not a reason for a particular detail of a mitzvah. So sometimes, some korbanot, you bring the korban, but you bring 7, and sometimes you bring 8. And Rambam says that there may be no rational basis for God having chosen 7 or God having chosen 8. And Leibovitz turns this into a huge, he generalizes from this, turns it into a huge thing that the entire Shemona Esrei is picked rather than chosen. It's like an arbitrary choice, and it wouldn't matter what words God said. Now, merely pointing all these things out already, I think, shows you, some of the weaknesses of the theory. But I think what does come across is, number one, is the fact that there is this powerful intuition that religion makes demands, even if that Rabbi Lichtenstein put it, a demand is less marketable than a promise. The point is, religion does make demands. It's not only about promises. Secondly, we've seen that the Shemona Esrei is about human needs and not about the needs of this individual or this community or that community. And I think that those are valuable. As far as the objections, the problems, well, I think that they're very significant and that the consequences of what I just enunciated are very, very difficult consequences. There's an expression I like to use, that one person's reductio ad absurdum is another's in hochinami, which means that sometimes you try to reduce a view to absurdity by showing its absurd consequences, and indeed Leibovitz's view has these really wild consequences, and yet the other person can simply say in the language of the Talmud, in hochinami, in fact, I embrace the consequence, I embrace this absurd consequence. But not everybody has to go along with that. So I think that this is a view that is not cogent, not particularly cogent, but it's a view that I think brings out certain things and makes us think a little bit more deeply about that pre-philosophical view. It does seem to weaken the pre-philosophical view. What I'd like to do now is to look at some other ways in which this pre-philosophical view is treated in other thinkers. Now, the subtitle of the talk has to do with Rabbi Soloveitchik and other recent thinkers. That's partly because Rabbi Silver invited me to speak before I knew what I would talk about. He said it would be a good idea to talk about the Rav. So I will talk about the Rav. I'll call him the Rav in the talk, not only because out of respect, but also save a little bit on time. Right? I have to say Soloveitchik each time. Okay. Now, Rav Soloveitchik wrote about prayer in a bunch of places. He wrote about it in Lonely Man of Faith. There's a short section. He wrote also an article that appeared in 1978. I think it was delivered in 1963 at the University of Pennsylvania. It's an article called Redemption, Prayer, and Talmud Torah. And then third is an essay of his called Rayonot al HaTfilah, which was translated in a collection of essays of his on prayer, a collection called Worship of the Heart. And those are three places, and the treatments, if you've studied Rav Soloveitchik, you know that you go from one source to another, and you can say very, very different things in one place than he says in the other, partly because he was constantly thinking and rethinking things, and partly because life experiences may have altered certain of his attitude to things and the like. But let me look at a couple of the things that he has to say about the significance of human needs within prayer. First of all, the first thing he says, this is in quote number 2, where he makes clear that he's not interested in the philosophical questions about why are some prayers effective and some prayers are not. The foundation of prayer is not the conviction of its effectiveness, but the belief that through it we approach God intimately. The basic function of prayer is not its practical consequences. It doesn't matter whether it's answered, but the metaphysical formation of the fellowship consisting of God and man. Now, this theme of fellowship I'll talk about a little more. Now go to quote number 4. Man is surely aware of many needs, but the needs he is aware of are not always his own. Quite often, man loses himself by identifying himself with the wrong image. Because of this misidentification, man adopts the wrong table of needs which he feels he must gratify. Prayer tells the individual as well as the community what his or its genuine needs are, what he should or should not petition God about. In a word, man finds his need awareness himself in prayer. Now, the idea is then that what prayer does is to sensitize you to what your needs are. You may have a false conception of things. You may think that prestige is something extraordinarily important. And prayer will sort of set you straight. The prayer book is where basic values are articulated. So you extract the values from the prayer book. That can happen regardless of whether the prayer is answered, regardless of whether you expect the prayer to be answered. The values are there, and you extract the values from there. Now, as an example of this, let's look at the next quote. Because here you see something in addition. And that is that Rav Soloveitchik emphasizes prayer. In quote number 5, Judaism, in contradistinction to mystical quietism, wants man to cry out aloud against any kind of pain, to react indignantly to all kinds of injustice or unfairness. For Judaism held that the individual who displays indifference to pain and suffering, who meekly reconciles himself to the ugly, disproportionate, and unjust in life, is not capable of appreciating beauty and goodness. Whoever permits his legitimate needs to go unsatisfied will never be sympathetic to the crying needs of others. What looked like an egoistic prayer, you were asking for yourself, I'm asking for my health, I'm asking for my prosperity, turns into the idea that yes, you were, but you were doing that. The reason you have to satisfy your own needs is that you have to care about your own needs. The reason you have to care about your own needs is so that then you will be sympathetic to the crying needs of others. Prayer will sensitize you to the other. So what looks egoistic turns into something altruistic, where it's there to sensitize you to the other. And he sees this also in respect to Job. At the end of the book of Job, Job has to pray for his friends. Prior to that, in chapter 2, Job had offered sacrifices, but only for his family. And Rav Soloveitchik sees a tremendous change in Job. And the change is won by coming to understand what his own needs were, and now he's more sympathetic to the needs of others. Some of this discussion reminds me of a very beautiful formulation in a related context. The context is Messianism, the belief in Mashiachiyut. There were certainly thinkers, let's say in the late 19th century, who believed that there will not be a true Messianic age, or certainly not a personal Messiah. But nevertheless, it's useful to keep the concept in our vocabulary and in our resources. Why? Because from looking at various Messianic visions, you can gain a perspective on what your values are. So for instance, if you value power, if your Messianic age consists of Jews holding power, then that will be your conception of what your values are in this world, in this current existence. If your concept of power, if your concept of Messianism is that in the Messianic age, knowledge will spread, as in Maimonides' view, then that's what you'll value now. And Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer formulated this point as follows. He said that a world without Messianism is a world without ethical imagination. A world without Messianism is a world without ethical imagination. And the Rav, I think, is saying something similar here, if I may link them, about prayer. That a world without prayer is a world without ethical imagination, or at least diminished in ethical imagination. So far you have then the following ideas having to do with petition. That number one, the purpose of petition really is for human beings to become aware of what their needs really are. And of course it's important to verbalize them, which is a topic in itself. Secondly, that by becoming aware of your own needs, you become ethical towards others. And the Rav put a tremendous emphasis upon the community nature, the altruistic nature of the praying person. to the point where he said that Judaism does not even so much value prayer, does not place the same value upon prayer as it does on other things as other religions might, because praying is really should really be about life. You should live what he called a prayerful life. And that if you live a life of injustice and ugliness, then it doesn't matter how much you pray. Because praying is really about this kind of ethical action. At the bottom of page 3 of the handout, there are some quotations from Lonely Man of Faith, and these suggest something still different. The Rav has a very nice discussion of the relationship between prayer and prophecy. Prophecy ceases. The men of the Great Assembly create the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, create prayer. He says both prayer and prophecy are communications between God and human beings. The difference is who initiates it. In the case of prophecy, it's God who initiates the conversation. In the case of human beings, it's the human being. In the case of prayer, rather, it's the human being who initiates the conversation. That's the connection between prayer and prophecy. But in both cases, there is some kind of a relationship. Almost, it was used terms like about friendship. So if you take a look here at number 9, quote number 9, in the second paragraph of it, the very essence of prayer is the covenantal experience of being together with and talking to God. Being together with and talking to God. And that the concrete performance, such as the recitation of texts, represents the technique of implementation of prayer and not prayer itself. Again, it's the technique of implementation of prayer, and it's not prayer itself. In other words, what's significant is not so much the petitioning, it's the relationship in which you petition. In short, he continues, prayer and prophecy are two synonymous designations of the covenantal God-man colloquy. Prayer is the continuation of prophecy. And then, well, within the prophetic community, God takes the initiative, and the prayer community, the initiative belongs to man. So here's a different idea. This is not about so much ethical sensitizing. It's about a relationship between a person and God. And that's really what prayer is all about. Quote number 13. Still another view. I know I'm bombarding you here with different views, but in a way that's the whole point. Rabbi Soloveitchik is very fertile on this point, showing you ways in which you do not have to view the prayer as really focused on getting what you want, even though you are petitioning. That's the strange thing. You are petitioning, but the understanding of what you are doing in petitioning is very different. Yes, I'm petitioning, but I'm petitioning so that I can understand my own needs, and by understanding my own needs, I'll be able to help others. Or I'm petitioning so I can form a relationship with God. The awareness which comes in prayer, with prayer, he writes, is rooted in man's experiencing his creatureliness. Sounds a little like Stephen Colbert's truthiness, right? Creatureliness and the absurdity embedded in his own existence. Something else. In other words, you're not there so much to request things, you're there to realize how creaturely you are. In this connection, I want to mention something that, among some of the mystics, I mentioned before something about mystical prayer. Among some of the mystics believed that it was wrong for human beings to pray to God for material things. Meister Eckhart, famous mystic of the Middle Ages, was among those who argued this way. And one of the reasons he gave us, he says, look, here I am with my own petty needs, and I'm bothering God to do this. I mean, it's a little bit like asking your Rosh Hashiva to go out and get you a turkey sandwich or something like that. And so Eckhart said that this is not something that makes sense to me to do. And there's a good critique of this in Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, whom we'll come to will probably a little bit later, which I'd like to look at page 5, and then we'll move backwards again, because Berkovitz, while you're doing that, I just got one thing out of my briefcase I forgot about. Okay. Berkovitz discusses this sort of view. The mystics thought that it's okay, in fact important, to pray for God for intellectual enlightenment or for mystical union, but it's wrong to pray for your material needs. And Berkovitz has this theme of creatureliness, where he says, look, Shemona Esrei is not just meant for the intellectual people, it's meant for everybody, and all of us are creatures, whether you're willing to admit it or not. You have needs. You have to have sustenance. You have to have health. Berkovitz says the following this. He says, well, first let me read you a line that actually I forgot to type in, but I did handwrite it in my copy. Since prayer is acknowledgement, this is Berkovitz, of man's dependence on his Creator, it is right to acknowledge it completely, even as regarding our most insignificant needs. Okay? You know, we really are dependent on God, and if we don't admit that we have these material needs, then we're basically not acknowledging our creatureliness. So he says, at best, the plea of the philosopher or the mystic will be prayer. But no more prayer, it's not to be better prayer, than the cry that reaches God in the dead of night, out of the dungeons of the soul along Skid Row. In fact, the philosopher who would pray to God only for the nobler things of life may easily be a pedantic bore. Imagine that God might be impressed with his ethics, but not with the hunger pangs of his poor ulcerated bowels. This idea of creatureliness, then, you articulate your needs in order to explain the fact, in order to understand the fact that you are a human creature. So there are a lot of ideas, and I'm sort of in the rough, and I've sort of run through them quickly. But as you look at them, you realize that, in the one hand, he does believe that you are petitioning God. But it's the significance of the petition. How do you understand what it is that you are really doing in petitioning? I'm acknowledging my creatureliness. I am sensitizing myself to the needs of others. I am being part of a community. I am becoming more aware of my own needs. The post-philosophical view, in other words, of petitionary prayer is one that sees petitionary prayer as a means to realizing other values besides simply getting what it is that you want. And as we read, very often you will not get what you want. Now the next two thinkers on my sheet, this is not sort of a parade of thinkers, but I just want to show you that Rabbi David Hartman has a critique of Rabbi Soloveitchik on prayer, in which he what should I say? He sort of he rejects certain parts of Rabbi Soloveitchik's view of prayer as reflecting too much of human dependence. Rabbi Hartman thinks that a dependent personality is something that's contrary to Judaism's belief in the adequacy of prayer. He points out that the institution of prayer itself is a reflection of human adequacy because of the fact that it was instituted by people. But he does need another way then to understand petitionary prayer. If you're not supposed to experience this feeling of dependence, then what are you doing? And he writes, when you discuss, quoting your needs in a love relationship, you do not necessarily expect your beloved to solve your problems. Reassurance and comfort may be gained simply through knowing that your beloved listens to you in your anguish, and that you are not alone in your plight. I understand petitional prayer as expressing the need of covenantal lovers of God to share their total human situation with God. So it's not about really getting your needs satisfied. It's about sharing. It's about expressing. It's about having a relationship in which you can speak freely. Petitional prayer reflects how the worshiper feels unembarrassed to bear his or her total situation and needs before the reality of a personal God. No human need is petty or trivial before the covenantal God, who commands a total way of human life. But again, you're bearing your situation. It's more about that. It's about communication, and not so much about satisfaction of the need. The Tzad HaShaveh, the common denominator of everything we have looked at so far, the thinkers we've looked at, is that all of them in one way or another move away from that pre-philosophical view of prayer that I spoke about. That it's not simply about getting what you need or getting what you're asking for. Yes, that's a piece of it, but there are other ways to explain what it is. Strangely enough, there is one Jewish thinker who I think really toes the pre-philosophical line, but in a very sophisticated philosophical way. And it's a bit of a surprise. The thinker is Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz. I say it's a surprise because Rabbi Berkovitz was always looked at as one of the most radical of the Orthodox theologians. He spoke about the development of halacha, and he said, for example, that the rabbis uprooted the sabbatical year, which made me nervous because I thought he meant just professors. Not what he meant. So he had this tremendous reputation as a liberal and as a radical, but in some of his philosophical writings, he takes a kind of conservative view, small c, and there is a good example in this book, a little book called Prayer. It's, I think, very well written, very well argued, and it kind of defends this sort of traditional idea that what you're doing is you're asking God for your needs. We saw the thing before about the importance of asking even for your material needs, and not to follow the mystics and asking only for the higher things. One contribution of this book, though, is explaining the importance of of obligation, the importance of having obligatory prayer rather than spontaneous prayer. And he quotes first from the Medrash Tehillim, this is the beginning here, a psalm of David in his kingship, right? David b'malcho, is a phrase we do not find, says the Medrash, but rather there is a psalm of David, Psalm 63, when he was in the wilderness, when he was in the Midbar. Now, what Chazal is saying there, according to the way Berkovitz reads it, and according to what looks like it could very well be the meaning of the text there, is that, this is kind of criticism of David. That he turned to God when he was in the wilderness, when he was in danger, and didn't turn to God when he was, living the high life as a king. And that text in Medrash also speaks about Bnei Yisrael doing the same sort of thing. So Berkovitz points out here the following: turning to God spontaneously in a time of trouble may cast a reflection on the value of such prayer, if it represents a small island of God-seeking in the midst of an ocean of God forgetting. Most of your life you're not paying attention to God because you're living high. Then if you suddenly turn to God at a moment of crisis, that's just not very impressive. In truth, the Berkovitz says, there is no type of time, there is no time in human life which is not an occasion for prayer. The Jew prays regularly because one ought to pray all the time but cannot do so. Once we, is this train of thought, through obligatory prayer, give expression to man's unceasing need to pray, okay? Once we, the obligatory prayer tells us that we always need God, and that God is always there for us, the individual may lose himself freely in the spontaneity of occasion condition praying, without suggesting that what one seeks and affirms occasionally has only occasional validity. There's the point of obligatory prayer, is to pray no matter what your personal circumstances are. It's obligatory, it's not about your personal circumstances. And if you do this 3 times a day, then you will be affirming 3 times a day that you understand that all of life is given by God as a gift. You will understand that God can satisfy your needs. All of those things, all of the affirmation that everything depends upon God, by doing that through obligatory prayer, then you sort of have shown that you recognize the truth that God is needed all the time and that He acts for us all the time, and therefore it takes away the criticism of your responding to God at a time of crisis. And this is why he says that the Chazal tell us, HaKol Shavim Lifnei HaMakom. It doesn't matter who it is who's praying. It doesn't matter what station the person is in life. Whether it's Moshe Rabbeinu, they quote Moshe as having issued tefillah, or it's tefillah la'oni ki yatov. It's that afflicted person who suddenly, in that state of affliction, he's turning to God. Both are the same. Both are equal. Because both of them need to recognize at all times their dependence on God. So again, it's kind of ironic that this is where Berkovitz, that it's Berkovitz who affirms almost more than anyone else the pre-philosophical view of prayer. The final thing that I would like to talk about is a kind of obvious question which may have been on people's minds from the very beginning, that I have not touched on the biggest problem with what we call petitionary prayer. And that is simply that it's not the universe in which we live, or in which we think we live. Many years ago, my wife and I took a vacation to Disney World, to Orlando. It was a hot, sweaty Orlando. It was the summertime, and the only other people going touring in Orlando was the convention from Helm, I think it was. And at the time, I was working on an article on Jewish responses to technological advance. And Walt Disney was very fascinated by technology. And there was a message for him in technology, which is that human beings, by the power of their imagination and by the power of their scientific minds, will be able to take nature under its control in order to improve the human condition dramatically. And as we went from exhibit to exhibit, I very annoyingly wrote down, my wife's annoyance, I wrote down on a little piece of paper things that I was picking up from the exhibit, phrases that I could wind up using in that article. Eventually I was going to claim the trip as a tax deduction. It didn't quite work. By the time I was finished, I got the following sentence, or half sentence, quote, academics love quoting themselves, somebody told me they had a professor, whenever you would ask him a question, he would get up on a ladder and go up to the top. Let's see what I have to say about that. Well, here's what the Rabbi David Shatz had to say. Second, I wrote, the concrete, palpable success of science in vanquishing disease, alleviating risk and pain in childbirth, increasing longevity, harnessing sources of energy, storing information, facilitating travel, detecting potential weather disasters, creating instant communications, saving trauma victims, treating mental disorders, promoting the welfare of the disadvantaged, and improving the overall comfort and quality of life. The message of Disney is that we got there, okay, by our own hands. We got this by scientific investigation. And what's really interesting to me, one of the things that's very interesting to me about Rabbi Soloveitchik, is that the entire discussion of petitionary prayer that I described seems to be very much in conflict with the activities of Adam the First, the lonely man of faith. And Adam the First, this technological man who's out for conquest, and Rabbi Soloveitchik believes that this is exactly right, this is exactly the way it should be, that civilization is produced by people involving themselves in medicine and government and politics and culture and so forth and so on. And all of that was shut out of the discussion of petitionary prayer. So the question becomes, given this sort of challenge, what does one say if one doesn't share the metaphysical scaffolding behind petitionary prayer? I mean, certainly some of the views that we looked at do presuppose something about the existence of God, relationship with God, communion with God. And here's a quote from Shalom Rosenberg. If you look at this, Shalom Rosenberg, a very celebrated Jewish philosopher, who did not quote himself often, but there was an awful lot there to quote. Rosenberg wrote, he, modern man, was brought up in a scientific worldview which presumes to offer a full and comprehensive explanation of all phenomena. And yet, in spite of this, he is bidden to stand in prayer. It is the paradox of the man who, in spite of knowing the laws of meteorology, stands and prays to God to Mashiv Haruach V'Merein HaGeshem, to cause the wind to blow and the rain to come down. How does a person living in a scientific universe of this sort, and mind you, in the Middle Ages there were many Jewish authorities who believed that nature controls a lot of the time. Ramban, Sefarno, Rabbeinu Bachai, and so forth. Living in an age in which we believe that a science which has actually brought progress, what does this do? Well, here, I think that, although I haven't developed this idea fully, I think that if you look back at some of the things we did tonight, look back at some of the theories, which are not really tied to this metaphysical view. Look back, for example, to the theory that prayer makes you aware of what are human needs, or that by sensitizing you to your own needs, you become sensitive to other people's needs. Look back at some of those ideas, and some of those ideas will not have the metaphysical scaffolding that causes people, problems and doubts and so forth in modern times, and they can provide a way of thinking about prayer that doesn't involve the metaphysics. The second thing I want to mention here is that there are philosophers today who believe that even though who somehow sense a presence, even if they do not sense a God or believe in a God. I'm reminded you of the Yizkor Jew, a Jew who all year round, never seen shul, comes to shul for Yizkor on Yom Kippur, reads the prayers about, well, may his soul rest in Gan Eden, Yenuch, Shalom, Al Mishkavo, and so forth and so on. Very moved. What is he or she thinking? It's not something the person believes, literally. What is happening? Is it that at that moment the person believes that the soul is in the next world? Is it that he's sort of living now in an imaginary thought world? Is it just that he takes it as language and metaphor? It's interesting to get into the heads. And it's interesting, therefore, to get into the heads of people who may themselves have doubts about it, who have doubts, but somehow at certain times sense a real presence. So I'm going to close with two quotes. I know that I've just left this as a question. This is in the spirit of Pesach. I have a feeling, kind of put this together a little hastily, and I think I realized in the spirit of Pesach I've left you with more questions than I have answers. But I'm going to close with two quotes. One is from Howard Westing, who was a professor of philosophy at the University of California at Riverside. There was an interview he had in the New York Times with Gary Gutting. It's a section of the Times blog called The Opinionator, which has had interviews with well-known philosophers. Howard Westing writes, "I wasn't speaking about what God is, nor do I know what he is. I was addressing my experience with its strange duality. In prayer, we express our deepest selves to God who understands. I pray, and I mean it. But I am blessed with an additional sense that in so supposing, I'm over my head. I don't know what I'm talking about," he writes. Both feelings are real and powerful. I'll leave that quote to you to ponder. And then Berkovitz, I'll leave you with a quote that you don't have in front of you from Berkovitz, which has a kind of triumphalist, chauvinistic tone to it, and yet, in some sense, I think it may emerge, or you may feel this way about some of the views we read this evening. Berkovitz writes, "The reconciliation of such opposing tendencies and conflicting ideas," where he's speaking about all of these philosophical problems about prayer, is the unique achievement of Jewish prayer. The Jews got it right. By chauvinistic. It meets superbly the problems of praying without sacrificing the naive simplicity of the trusting, Godward-turned human being. And so, this is a sort of defense, then, in some way, of the quote, naive simplicity of the trusting, Godward-turned human being. But I think that you've seen that what he calls here the naive, simple view is not the only way to do business, and that there are a lot of different ways to understand the place of human need in prayer. Thank you very much. I had too many words in front of me on the page. I felt a little disjointed as I was talking. I hope it didn't come out that way. All right. Any answers? This is like Jack Jeopardy. You give me the answer. I'll come back to the question. Okay. All right. I was praying for this result. Sim shalom. Okay.
I couldn't help but wondering. I couldn't help but wondering as you were talking about Soloveitchik, and some of the things I've read is about prayer. And I think people keep telling me he's not the guy you want to read about prayer. I don't know why people keep telling me that, but it's always stuck with me. But as you were talking about Leibniz and saying everything reduces for him to your servant, right? It doesn't matter what you're doing really. That's the only commonality of what you're doing. It's all about service. And everything reduces to that. You could be saying anything in the world, doesn't matter, because the kavanah is service. And Soloveitchik, I thought that with Tefillah, it almost came out of the same thing, but with different emphasis, not service so much as vulnerability. And maybe the different Lotes and Shemona Esrei are all different meditations, different angles or facets of getting you into that mode of the ways in which you're vulnerable, the ways in which you're dependent. And I didn't see that so much as necessarily about cultivating an ethic, although I love the idea that you have to tolerate in yourself vulnerability skills, tolerate in others, but to cultivate that mentality.
Yeah, I mean, see, Rav has several different things going. I was going to go into once, not necessarily at once, because some of these are from different writings. Vulnerability is a very, very big theme. Is a very big theme in his writings. In fact, one of the characteristics of his work is precisely that he speaks about human weakness, human fragility, and so forth. And even in Lonely Man of Faith, if you actually read all the quotes I gave, even there, it's not as one-sided as I make it out. And people sometimes say, well, Lonely Man of Faith is all about prayer, is communion, but it's not true. If you look at the footnotes, you see a lot of this other stuff. What I think in terms of what you were saying, maybe just repeat it once more, make sure I'm not forgetting.
No, I think that what I was wondering was whether the emphasis for him is that each of the below is a different way of accessing a sense of dependence.
Yeah, I think that's true. It could certainly be true in many of the cases. I mean, he has much more specific analyses. But there's also, it has another idea about the difference about how you react to crisis, which may actually reflect this. One is what he calls the stage of muteness, where you say nothing because you're so dumbfounded, you have nothing to say. Then there's the state of tzedakah. You cry out and the thoughts are not verbalized. And then there's the state of articulation. And I would think that at different stages of the Shemona Esrei, people will have different abilities to articulate and different ways in which the text will resonate for them at that particular moment. Does that get to your question? Yeah, I think that's definitely very. Look, I mean, frankly, I went through. In my family there was a major medical problem this year, and I landed in Megillah this year, and every year. And this time I said, "Shafiyonu kiyimonu v'gilnu l'zman hazeh." It had a resonance for me that it had not had before. I'm sure that people go through this all the time. You find when people depending on what life was like, you can have gushes and gushes of tears, and you can have some people that are just saying the words. There's no question of life circumstance determines how you do it. And of course, for Leibovitz, all of this is kind of irrelevant. This opens up a much larger issue, which I didn't get into, about the relationship between individual need and community need. As the Shemona Esrei is framed in the community, how much are you allowed to sort of put yourself into that? Me as an individual. Am I allowed, for example, to insert a prayer for myself at a certain point in the Shemona Esrei? It's a much larger thing. So if you do too much of this kind of adjusting your feeling according to what you experience, then you might be intruding, putting your ego in there too much.
Thank you. I don't mean to focus on Rav Soloveitchik, but in the quote that you
don't
shared
mean
with us, in short, prayer and prophecy are two synonymous designations of the covenantal guardian and co-chair. We've heard throughout these weeks, this idea being brought up. It seems to me that Rav Soloveitchik is, and I'm going to use Star Trek.
Okay.
It sounds like a mind meld, which is what I personally believe. But I've gotten other ideas.
A mind
meld, it's Spock, mind melding with God.
Oh, okay, right.
But I think what's going, but others, Rav Silver and others have spoken of how the relationship to Nebuah is about imagining. It's about imagination. Maybe in the John Lennon sense. But that's really, imagine
You're attributing a lot of cultural knowledge to me. I do have it.
Very spiritualistic. So is Rav Soloveitchik, what are his thoughts on this? And
in terms of melding? In terms of melding,
or is it that we should relate to, how to better the world, or better oneself, the community, etc.
Well, I'm not sure which is the dichotomy. On the one hand, there's bettering the world, and then on the other hand, there's
on the other hand, it's just being with God in this very private, intimate, but very private relationship.
Well, okay. In a lot of the places where he writes, Soloveitchik puts a lot of emphasis upon the ethical. Okay, we have sort of seen that. The place where you have probably what looks like the most what we call the mind melding is in the Vikashtem Misham, and from there you shall see, where he speaks about what is the concept of dveikus. And it turns out that the way that dveikus is explained, it's done through sort of odd medieval principle, but it does ultimately turn to the sphere of action. And one thing that I noticed in a lot of, I've been doing some work on this sort of thing, very often he'll take a concept like Kedusha and so forth and deliberately interpret it not as a retreat from the world, not as restraint, but rather as engagement with the world and so forth. And prophecy has this ethical thrust to it. Some of the quotations here actually suggest that that I had here tonight about the ethical will. Number 12, prayer likewise consists not only of an awareness of the presence of God, it's on page 4, but an act of committing oneself to God and accepting His ethical, moral authority. There's always some connection or other to ethics that takes place, and somehow it all comes together. The Vikashtem Misham is the place where he really maps that out most fully.
So it's less about bettering the world.
Well, no, it is more about it. I think that's my reading is more about it, but the dichotomy maybe is a little too sharp because there's obviously room for both of these. But one of the things he's trying to work out is the relationship between Talmud Torah and an ethical action. I mean, already in Isha Halacha, there's a lot of tension there as to what's really. All of a sudden you're reading halachic man of these giant conceptual structures, and then he says, and what is the function of the rabbi? It's to help the poor and the oppressed. And you wonder, where did that come from? Very often there's this turn, and you just kind of don't expect it. I've seen this pattern in a lot of ethical behavior and making sure there's no injustice and corruption and cruelty. Not to say that this was a tikkun olam sort of philosophy, but engagement. But everything else in our Soloveitchik is a dialectic. Yes.
I don't know if you can answer this, and it's just what I'm thinking.
It's a mystical question.
The four terms that are standing out in my head are our vulnerabilities, our creatureliness, our dependence, and our ego. And I could put the first three in one category: dependence, creatureliness.
Well,
I'm trying to understand if we take those three maybe as a similar world, then how do we distinguish what's not ego while acknowledging what is?
Well, start with creatureliness. I don't think creatureliness in and of itself doesn't, I think, dictate any particular result about vulnerability. You could be a creature. Well, it depends what you mean. But if you mean by creatureliness somebody who's vulnerable, yes. But otherwise, the mere fact that I'm a creature and the fact that I have certain needs doesn't yet by itself show that I'm completely dependent in satisfying those needs. I mean, you could have a theory of human adequacy, okay, of our ability to take ourselves under control. One doesn't follow from the other.
Well,
you can have a strong sense of creatureliness, and then you try to, by your own efforts, pull yourself out of that. But they're not necessarily connected.
Okay, but how would you designate the category of ego as opposed to those other three, whether they're the same or not, or similar or not?
Well, ego is not the same as vulnerability.
I know.
Right? Yeah.
What I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't get the question. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Ego, vulnerability.
Well, I assume that the vulnerability, creatureliness, and dependency, which we discussed in different places.
Okay, right. You feel. Right.
Yeah, that in a large part.
If you have a sense of ego, then you feel vulnerable?
No. It seems like the ego part is what we want to work our way out of. While the other three we have to acknowledge and perhaps even use to enhance our ability to pray.
Unless, ego or self-interest might be, and this is the point that the Rav made here, is that self-interest might be very important for caring about others.
The term ego is difficult
Because it has a value connotation, you mean because it has a
Ego
negative,
seems very distinct from recognizing my vulnerability. In fact, I would say people with big egos can't acknowledge their vulnerability.
Yeah, but I think I mean different things. I think you're thinking of an egotist, like a convention of egotists. Hi, how am I? Fine myself. That's a lot different. This is I don't think that's what in this sense of egoism, it really simply means following your self-interest. I mean, I personally believe. See, without self-interest, so stucco, for example, would not be terribly important because each person who gets stucco just passes it on to someone else, and there's sort of no point to it. It's only because people have this kind of self-interest, their work. There's a story about I think it was about Soloveitchik, Nero's grandfather, who they devised a plan to distribute money to the poor before Pesach. And he said that we have very good news about the plan. The poor have agreed to accept. Well, if the poor are not agreeing to accept, then the whole plan falls apart. That's the truth. So I don't think it's ego, self-interest, and so forth. I think, and I think if you look at some specific ethical decisions, you sometimes find that prioritizing the self can sometimes be justified. That's what
Just to say,
Yeah.
I don't know if you intend this, but Trump doesn't make a big deal about so-called majestic man.
Yeah, well, that's what I got to at the end, Adam the First.
Yeah, I mean, that's very central for him. So they did that a person is actually important, they call it amida as opposed to feel.
Right.
That's
Yeah,
very
I
important for the
did.
Rav.
Yeah, I didn't take the question to be specifically about the Rav, but just in general.
Oh.
That's why I took it. But about the Rav, it's certainly Adam the First, majestic man. That's why when you read the material on prayer, it just seems so distant from the material about majestic man. And yet, within Lonely Man of Faith, prayer coexists. Okay. Oh, thank you.